Hey everyone, this is Amanda from Wayward and Whimsical Creations, and today I am doing a little tutorial on how I alcohol ink my dragon scales. I had a couple people ask if I could show my process, so this is that video. Let's get into the materials needed. First off, you're going to need scales. I personally love using the frost colored scales from the Ringlord, whether it's large, medium, or small. Because it's a matte color, the alcohol inks really pop against the frost scale. If you're trying to do alcohol inks over a colored scale, color's not going to show up as nicely. So frost scales from the Ringlord. You're also going to need alcohol inks. I really love the Ranger brand ink from Tim Holtz. I've also worked with Panada brand inks. I know there's a couple other brands out there. I just haven't had a chance to try them yet. Those two are brands I really love using. You're also going to need something to apply the ink to your scales. I personally love using the generic brand Magic Eraser. I can get a big box at Walmart and then I cut them up to size. You can also get a felt stamper that is sold specifically for alcohol inks. My only issue with that is that the felt tends to leave little fuzzies on your scales, and it's really hard to pick them off after the fact, so I find the sponges to be superior. You're also going to need some sturdy cardboard, a large piece of cardboard to cover your work area because alcohol inks can be super messy, and then some cardboard cut up into smaller pieces that you're going to adhere your scales to. You're going to need some removable tape. You want to make sure it's removable. I use this to adhere my scales to these smaller pieces of cardboard, and you want it removable so you can easily pop your scales off and those tape won't leave any residue on your scales after you're done inking and sealing them. Excuse me. I'm sorry if I sound a little harsh or if I'm a little sniffly. I'm just getting over a really bad cold. You're also going to need some isopropyl alcohol. I use 91% isopropyl alcohol. I have some in a little mister here, and I also have some in a little squeeze bottle. I also use a heat gun. You don't necessarily need one of these. You can get the same effect by blowing on the scales. I just find a heat gun to be a little more efficient. Gloves. Don't forget to wear gloves. The inks can and will stain your skin. I had to learn that the hard way. So make sure you've got a pair of gloves. So to start, we're going to adhere our scales to a piece of cardboard. So I'll take my removable tape and I'll do about 3 lines across to do 1 row of scales, and then I'll stick my scales on and I'll press them down so they're secure. And I like to work in small batches like this. It's easier for me to handle it. If I try to do a huge thing of cardboard of scales, it gets a little overwhelming. Okay, once your scales are secure, you're going to take one of your little sponges and you're going to grab your alcohol inks and you're going to apply your inks to your sponge. Now, I'm going to show you a couple different techniques. If you're just using one color, just apply that color to your sponge like so, and then you're going to stamp the scale like so. You're going to let this dry completely. Now, you could leave it like this. That's a really pretty color, but I like to go in for some more detail and kind of give it like a splatter effect, or they call them like creating cells. And what I found, when you want to create cells, the less ink you have on your sponge, the better effect you get. So what I'll do is I'll take my sponge and I'll kind of dab it on my cardboard to get rid of some of that excess ink. And then when I go back over my scale, I am going to barely, and I mean barely, touch it. And you see how that's making the inks kind of move. And sometimes if I don't want the inks to spread as fast, I'll hit it with my heat gun. So I'll like do a dab and then hit it with my heat gun. And then you can see it kind of gives that, excuse me, splatter kind of splotchy effect. And that's just using one color. Again, I apologize if I sound rough. I have been super sick the last couple days and I'm just now starting to finally feel better. Now, if you're using more than one color, there's a couple different things you can do. There's one technique I call color blocking, where you can take multiple colors and we're just going to block out these colors on our sponge. And you can use as many colors as you want, although I will warn you, the more colors you add, the muddier it can get if you're going over your scale too many times. I find 3 or 4 colors to be best if you're looking to give your scale some dimension using multiple colors. So again, I'm just going to go over my scale like so. And then I like to, you know, do it at different angles, twist my sponge around to see the different effects I can get. And again, before I go in and do my next layer, I'm going to let these dry completely. And if I want them to dry a little quicker, I'll hit them again with my heat gun, or you can get the same effect by blowing on them. I just find blowing on them not to be very efficient in a video. Again, I'm going to kind of dab my sponge to get some of that excess color off. And again, when I go back over my scales, I am barely touching them the second time around. Like just a quick little dab. And then again, if I want the inks to dry a little faster and not spread as far, I'll hit them with my heat gun. Another thing you can do, once you put your base layer down, you can also get kind of a spackle effect by using isopropyl alcohol. So I'll take this little mister here and I'll hold it a little ways away from my scales and I'll just give them a little spritz. And as you can see, it kind of makes a speckled effect. So it all depends on, you know, what you're going for on how you do it. And the nice thing about alcohol inks is they're a very forgiving medium. So if I didn't like how any of these scales turned out, I could easily just rinse them with some isopropyl alcohol, strip the color off, rinse them off with water, let them dry, and start all over. But really, it's a lot of experimentation. I have a bunch of different colors of alcohol inks, and you know, it's trying to see what colors work well together, what colors blend nicely, what colors don't work. It's a lot of experimentation. Another technique I'll do is I'll do stripes to get kind of like a rainbow effect. So I'll take my colors and I'll do thinner stripes like this. And then once again, when you go over the scale the first time, you're pressing pretty firm to get all that color out. And again, I'll move my sponge around so I can get different angles. And if you want, you could leave the scales just like this, but I really like to go back over and kind of blend the colors. I think it really gives the scales some interesting depth and dimension. And again, less ink on the pad, the better kind of speckling effect you'll get. So I'll take my sponge and I'll stamp it out on my cardboard just to get rid of some of that excess ink. And then again, when I'm going over my scales, I'm barely touching them, just like bam, bam, just real quick. You know, if I want the inks to dry a little quicker and not spread as much, I'll hit it with my heat gun. But really just, you got to just kind of have fun with it. Play around with colors, see what blends well together, see what doesn't. I mean, some color combinations work really well. Others, you know, I do one scale and it's like, oh, well, that's not cute. You know, but again, very forgiving medium. All you got to do is rinse these off with isopropyl alcohol, rinse them off with water, let them dry, and start over. Bam. Look how pretty those are. Now, of course, I would probably go back over these a couple more times to get some more details, but I'm trying to keep this video as short and sweet as possible. So once your scales are done being inked, I usually let them dry at least overnight, and then I will start the sealing process. So the sealing process is probably the longest step when it comes to alcohol inked scales, but you have to seal the inks to protect them from scratching and from fading. Alcohol inks are what they call a color fast medium, meaning that if they are overexposed to direct sunlight, the colors can and will fade. But there are steps you can take to prevent that. So the very first layer I do when I'm sealing the scales is this. It's called Krylon Workable Fixative. And what this does is it prevents the inks from reactivating. And by reactivating, I mean if you try to add another protective layer before you do the Workable Fixative, it's going to make your inks spread and kind of blend and kind of turn everything into a little bit of a muddy mess. So one layer of Workable Fixative, I let that dry for an hour, and then I come in with this UV resistant clear. And this is what's gonna help prevent our inks from fading. Depending on the project, 3, 4, maybe sometimes even 5 layers if it's something I know someone's gonna be wearing out in the sun occasionally, with about an hour, excuse me, an hour dry time in between each layer. Once this layer, I'm finished with this, I am going to let the scales dry for a full 24 hours before I come back in with my UV resin. And you need a hard type UV resin. And then when I apply this, I'll do a little dab on each scale, and then I use a little silicone brush to spread it around, make sure it coats all the scales. I'll do all the scales on a single piece of cardboard, and then I'll pop them under a UV lamp to harden them. And then once I'm done with that, I'll usually let them sit for about 8 hours just to make sure they're completely cured before I use them in whatever project I'm going to use them in. Now, these can be used in a lot of different projects. I mainly use them in dragons and jewelry. I prefer to use them in pieces that I consider static, that don't get a lot of movement. The dragons, unless you're using it as a fidget toy, I wouldn't recommend inked scales for that. But if it's just sitting up on a shelf out of the sunlight, not getting moved or handled very often, these work beautifully. Jewelry too, pendants, earrings, these make really nice accents. I would not recommend using inked scales for any piece that's going to see a lot of movement. So take like scale dice bags, for example. You're always going to be constantly handling them, opening and closing them. And I would just really be afraid of the scales getting damaged and the resin possibly chipping. Same with like shoulder armor or any type of scale armor, really. I know I've seen other chain mailers make a couple pieces of scale mail with inked scales, I just personally wouldn't do it. I would be so afraid of the scales getting damaged. But if you're using them in static pieces, even jewelry, make sure you're not wearing it in direct sunlight super often. The colors will last a really long time. My husband has a dragon that I made about 5 years ago for Father's Day, and the colors are still beautiful on the scales, but it sits on a dresser out of direct sunlight. It doesn't get a whole lot of movement. So do with that information what you will. But most of all, have fun with it. It's all about experimentation, seeing what colors blend well together, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't. And like I said, alcohol inks are a very forgiving medium. You can literally rinse these off with isopropyl alcohol, wash them, let them dry, and start all over if something doesn't come out. So that is how I alcohol ink and seal dragon scales. I almost forgot. Make sure you're working in a well-ventilated room. When I paint scales, I'm usually at my desk. I have a window slightly cracked. I have an air purifier going. I normally wear a respirator. I didn't for today's video just because I wanted you guys to be able to hear me, and the respirator tends to muffle your voice. And I didn't do very many scales. Usually I'm painting a lot more than this. So I always wear a respirator when I'm inking, when I'm sealing. You want to make sure you're safe when you're doing this process. So that is all there is to it. If you guys have any more questions about this process, make sure to leave them in the comments. Otherwise, happy experimenting.